Hello, and welcome to this episode of our Blender series in which I will give you 50 tips and tricks to navigating Blender. These tips will hopefully cover some essentials to make your Blender experience much better and more streamlined. So let's not waste any more time and jump straight in. So to kick off this episode, we're going to look at customizing our own key maps. So to do that, what we want to do is go over to Edit, Preferences, and come down to the tab that says Key Maps. If you're more interested in having, say, the Maya or the industry standard version of keybinds, you can go up to industry compatible up here, where it will hopefully reflect that of Maya and other industry compatible softwares. If you want to make your own, for example, so for me, creating a new file is Control N, so if I click Control N now, you'll see that it says new file. We can go general. But if you wanted to, say, have it where it's like Control Shift P, for example, to make a new file, so now if I hit Control Shift P, I can make a new file that way. If you end up realizing that you might have made a mistake and you don't want to have these options anymore, we can just click Restore, like so. So hopefully that's covered our customizing of key maps. Tip number 2 is learn shortcuts. So instead of having to select our cube, for example, and going over to our bar over here where we can move like so, or rotate like so, or even scale like so, or even coming up here to object, transform, and then rotating that way, to which we don't really have much control because our rotation is based up here from where we selected, and I'll show you with the move tool. So our move tool is at the world origin now, but our object's down there. So what's nice is if we use shortcuts, for example, and just remove that, so if we press G, we actually now feel like we're moving the object where we want, and rotate tends to feel a bit more responsive depending on where you start rotating from. So if I know I'm rotating over here, it's going to turn a lot slower, and the closer I get is the quicker it spins. So you don't really get that if you do transform and rotate up here, because you just can't see your cursor for one thing. So learn shortcuts, because that will save you a lot of time. Tip number 3 would be learn the buttons for the different perspectives. So on your number pad on the side, you can press 1 for the y-axis, 3 for the x-axis, and 7 for the z-axis. So what you can then do is if you hold Control and then 7 or 3 or 1, you'll basically get the inverted view of the y, x or z direction. And then what 2 and 8 do is 2 seems to pan down, 8 seems to pan up. And then what 4 and 6 do is they basically orbit like so. So 6 is anti-clockwise, 4 is clockwise. So yeah, just having that means you can easily get the X or Y direction instead of attempting to try and line it up like so. Tip number 4 is don't be afraid to split your windows, and what I mean by that is if we come over to the top right corner of our workspace and wait for the crosshair or plus icon to appear and then click and drag, we can split our screen in half, quarters, really thin if you really want to, and then what we can do is we can make this into our shader editor, for example. Then we can drag this one up and then make that into our UV editor. And what this does is it basically gives us our own custom workspace. So we've got, again, like I say, we can work on our 3D object here. We can make sure the UVs are fine as we go, and then we can texture as and when we need to. And then we can also look at our texture while looking at our UVs, and then we can see it in a 3D viewport. Even though that is what this shading tab somewhat does, we might want to work vertically as opposed to horizontally, and we might not even need this file browser. Granted, we can easily get rid of it by dragging the cursor, crosshair, plus icon into it, like so, but sometimes you might want your own custom layout because that's what you prefer. Tip number 5 is collections keep everything neat and tidy, in terms of if we come up here and select our scene collection, make a new collection and call this one lights, and if we made another one and we call this one camera, it means we can keep our cameras in one and our lights in another, and it just keeps everything organized and clean as opposed to having multiple items in the same collection. So if I had one and I wanted to call it rocks, for example, so long as I've got the collection highlighted, I can import I don't know, Suzanne for example, so she's one of our rocks. I'm going to import an icosphere, that's another one of our rocks. And then if I want to import a Taurus, say, this is our third rock. And basically everything's appeared in rocks. And then if we wanted to add another light, so long as we've got our light selected, we can then import our point light and bring it up over here, for example, and we now have 2 lights. So this segues us into tip number 6, which is basically learn the viewport, render and selection buttons, basically our filters on our collections. So if we come over here and we disable our lights in viewport, it does mean that they'll still be there in render. So what I'm going to do is just pull up and bring our camera to view, for example, and then do this. So if we look at our render preview, we'll see that everything is fairly lit up due to our HDRI. And then if we apply our regular lights, so for example, I'm just going to throw this up to a lot of power to the point where you'll see that there is definitively something happening there, and then I'll bring it more forward so we can see it on the camera view. So that's there, but we're going to disable it in our viewport. But if we hit F12 and go to our render view, the light is still active. So learning when to turn those on or off really help, especially when it comes down to rendering, because I have had it in the past where I've gone to render something and then I've accidentally turned the viewport off but kept the render on, like so, like you've just seen here. So yeah, make sure you're aware of those, and there are more filters. So there's disable viewports, there's holdouts, and there's even indirect. I won't go through all of them, but basically you'd think these two are the same. If you disable one, it disappears, but from my experience, this one doesn't actually do anything in terms of, yes, it hides, but if we were to have a simulation, say, so I'm just going to make this into an emitter real quick, and then what we'll see is they just phase through this cube. So if I made it so the cube bounces particles off, for example, so I'm just going to really supersize it here, and then click play, we'll see that our particles are bouncing and jumping. So with this cube, this being our collision, if we hide in viewport and then reset the simulation, you'll see that it still bounces them off. And even if we truly reset the simulation and we come over to our particles and increase it by 1 and then click play, we'll see that they still bounce. However, if we come over to our cube and disable it in viewport and then click play, so as we can see it's still cached, but if we then just reset our simulation now, we'll see that they phase through. So just be aware of the differences that these have and apply them as and when you need them. Tip number 7 is basically have overlays that will help with your workflow and your projects and keeping an eye on things. So for example, I have a statistics overlay because I do 3D modeling and 3D printing, and I can just keep an eye on this to make sure that I'm not going overboard. So to activate overlays, you can simply come to the overlays tab up here, and then I also have face orientation to keep an eye on my normals. But generally, yeah, my statistics is there. We can have performance, so I don't really need that because Blender's either chugging along and moving slowly, or it's fine as it is. So yeah, use overlays because they can really help out when you want to identify where things might be wrong. So for example, these normals, that normal is the wrong way, so then I know to recalculate and make it the right way. Tip number 8 would be set up quick favorites. So what I tend to do is I like having my origin towards the bottom of an object because it means when I use snapping, it actually snaps to the bottom of the object. So this would involve a process of selecting a face, Shift S, cursor to selected, then tabbing out, and then it would be object, set origin to 3D cursor, and then it would be put the cursor back to the world origin. So yeah, not a massive waste of time, but it's a task that I do fairly repeatedly. So what I can do is go to import a cube and then select the face like so, go to F3 and type in cursor to selected, and then we can right click and add to quick favorites like so. So now if we come out of object edit mode, we can now come into object mode, go object, set origin, Origin to 3D cursor, and again right click and add to quick favorites like so. So now if I go to tab and then select this face, I can press Q, which brings up our quick favorites like so, so cursor to selected, and then Q again, origin to 3D cursor, and then I can put the cursor to world origin. So there's much more operations that can be done that can utilize our quick select, and if you find that the quick select you don't need anymore, you can just simply right click it and then click remove from quick favorites like so. Tip number 9 is adjust your max min for clipping. So as you can see, our clip starts at 0.1 meters and ends at 1000. So we're going to adjust our clip start first. So for example, I do 3D printing, and if I was working on something that's quite small like so, and we scope in and just zoom in, we can see that our clipping has just begun here. So what we can do is go to our view and we can add a couple of zeros, which means now we can get more close and personal with our object. So for example, I can get even closer like so, and it's there. Whereas what we had normally at 0.1 is we basically wouldn't see any of our model full stop. So the same can be said for the exact opposite. If we zoom out far enough away and we see where our solid color meets our grid, we know that this is 1000 meters away. And what we can do is we can add a 0 to see further. So for example, if we had a mountain range and some trees, it means that we can now see them. And if we had a lot of detail in this scene, like if we have a close-up but we have a huge background and Blender starts to chug and the background's perfect and we still need to work on what's in the foreground, we can just theoretically move a 0 or remove a 0, and then it means that that won't render into our viewport, and then we'll have a faster process of dealing with what's in the foreground. So one thing to be aware of is, even though we have our 10,000 meter end and our 0.001 meter clip start, our cameras don't necessarily come in with those details to begin. So our clip start for our camera is 0.1, so for example we would bring that down to 0.001 just so we can see our cube like so. But at the same time, if we move out far enough away, this is 1000 meters. So what Blender does quite well with this is what we see on our regular view. This is our 10,000 meters, and if we go into our camera, it ignores this and gives us our 1000 meters that our camera sees. So we can just change that to 10,000, and now we can see what we can see. And it just means that when we come to render, we can work in the viewport faster, but the render will actually capture everything accordingly. So tip number 10 is to apply location, rotation and scale. So to showcase this might be a bit of a longer part. So we're just going to make our collection and we're going to call this location, rotation and scale like so. And what we're going to do is we're just going to bring in a cube and then select the top face, insert, extrude, extrude, and then just to make it different, we're going to extrude on the one side. So what we're going to do is bring this over on the X, and if we add a mirror modifier, we'll see that it's mirrored locally on itself. So if we do Ctrl A and apply location, we'll see that it's now over here. The same can be said for rotation. So if we brought in another cube and we rotated on the Y by 45 degrees and the X by 45 degrees, and then we moved it up and brought it over to our object here and just sat it on top like so. If we apply the location at least, if we then go to generate another mirror, you'll see that it's now basically mirrored directly on its local axis. So again, if we reset the transforms of basically applying our rotation, it's now where we want it. And then the same can be said for scale. So if we again bring in another cube and just scale it down without applying it there, and we move it up on the Z, and then we move it on the X by maybe 10, and then move it on the Y by 10, like so. And then what we can do is if we bring in a empty and rotate that on the Z by 30 degrees, because what you'll see is we're trying to get a circle of these cubes. So if we go to generate an array like so, and then set it to transform and put it to our empty object like so, you'll see that we've got a much bigger cube than before. So if we just make more of them, we'll see that they gradually get bigger. So if we apply our location like we wanted, we'll now see that it goes the other way. We've got our curve motion, but they are huge. So all we have to do is go to Control A and apply scale, and now we have our cubes going in a circle and they're all the same size. So this is why we apply rotation, location and scale. And that wraps up our first 10 Blender tips and tricks. If you found these useful, there are 40 more waiting for you in the next episodes, each one building on what we've covered today and then some. So thank you for watching, and I'll either see you there or I'll see you in the next one.